Welcome to South Central Regional Library Safe Inside Your Walls programming, supported by Safe at Home Manitoba. Hi, my name is Linda and I'm a librarian and a knitter. This series of videos is all about how to knit a super simple block Afghan. So far, we've looked at materials, casting on, and the knit stitch. Today, I'm going to show you how to cast off and how to purl. Last time, we talked about materials and learned the knitted cast on, which is like this. And the knit stitch. To make this Afghan, we want square blocks. You can measure your block to see if you've got the right length. But I often use this quick way to check. I fold the knitting so one side is right up against the underside of my holding needle, and I see how close the bottom edge is to the unfolded side. If it doesn't reach, I still have a few rows to go. If it matches, I've got a square, and if it goes past, I've knit too far. But looks like I've got it just about right here, so that means it's time to cast off. Like everything in knitting, there are a bunch of different ways to cast off. But this one is simple and it's a nice firm edge, not very stretchy at all, so do make sure that you keep your tension loose as you're going. To cast off, you start by knitting 2 stitches. Now, use the tip of your holding needle to lift the first stitch you knit up and over the second stitch and off the end of the working needle. Now, knit another stitch, lift the stitch before it up, over, and off with your holding needle, and so on. When you get to the last cast off and you have only 1 stitch left on your needle, cut your yarn. Leave a tail long enough to be able to thread into a yarn needle to weave in, at least a hand's width. Slip this stitch back to your holding needle, knit it, and pull a tail through the loop, right through it instead of leaving it as a loop. Congratulations, you've finished your first block. There's one thing you can do to make your block edges a little tidier. This is completely optional, but it is pretty easy. You've probably noticed that knitting into the first stitch of the row comes out a bit uneven and you get a bumpy edge down the side. But what you can do is a slip stitch edge, which takes care of both the evenness, unevenness, and the bumpiness. And it's pretty simple. You knit the first 19 stitches of the row as usual. Before you knit the 20th and final stitch, move the yarn to the near side of the needle. Now, slip your working needle through the 20th stitch as if you're going to knit it, but then just slide it to the working needle without doing anything else. Then, turn your knitting around and keep going, slipping the last stitch just like this of every row. That gives you this nice, tidy edge. Now, cast on, knit, and cast off are all the techniques you need for this particular Afghan until it's time to put all your blocks together, which we'll cover in episode 4. But if you want to take the next step in knitting, you'll want to learn how to purl. If you don't want to learn at this point, you don't have to. Just keep on knitting while I chat and don't bother doing what I do. But if you are interested, okay, so here we are. We're a couple of rows into the next block, and we're going to start purling this row. When you're making a knit stitch, you have the yarn on the far side of the needle, the side away from you, and you're sliding your needle from the near side to the far side, and then pulling the yarn back through to the near side. Purling is the opposite. So, you move the yarn under the needle to the near side. You slide your needle into the stitch from the far side, and then you pull a loop from the near side back to the far side. This time, you're sliding your working needle point in the opposite direction from the holding needle point. Again, that's yarn to the near side, needle from far side to near, wrap around, pull to the far side. You'll notice that I'm using the terms far side and near side instead of front and back, and there's a reason for that, but I'll get into that in a minute. Let's finish this row of purl stitches first. I remember the first time I was showed how to purl, I said, that's it? I thought purl stitch would be so much more complicated and special, but thankfully it's actually as simple as a knit stitch. Okay, that's the last stitch. Let's turn the knitting around. The bottom here, these ridges, this is what's called garter stitch, and it's what you get when you knit every row. Up here, this smooth part, this is called stockinette stitch, and it's what you get when you knit one row and then purl one row. Notice how the two rows look like they're exactly the same stitch. This one looks exactly like the one below it. That's because, and you might have noticed this already, knit and purl stitches are mirror images of each other. Knit stitches bring the loop from the far side of the needle to the near side. Purl stitches bring the loop from the near side of the needle to the far side. And when you knit them in the same row, they're opposites. But when you knit them on alternating rows, they look the same. Because on the second row, you've turned your knitting around, so the side that was the far side of the needle becomes the near side. This is why some knitting patterns talk about right side rows and wrong side rows of knitting. The right side is the side that's meant to be seen. The wrong side is the side that's meant to be hidden, like the outside and inside of a sweater. As long as you're knitting flat or back and forth, half of the rows will be knit with the wrong side nearest you and half with the right side nearest. But since you're only looking at the knitting from one side when it's done, the pattern has to account for that. This Afghan accounts for that by having all the blocks knit in garter stitch, which gives you a pattern that's identical on both sides without having to do anything fancy. You can get the same garter stitch effect by purling every row as well. So if you want to practice purling by purling an entire block, it will look like a knit every row block as well. For this particular Afghan, we use 36 blocks. 6 blocks wide, 6 blocks long. 18 will be in one color, 18 in the other. If you want though, you can make yours bigger or smaller, make it 3 wide and 6 long, whatever shape and size you want. And because you're knitting it in blocks, you can change up the blocks. You can knit every block in garter stitch if you want, like the sample Afghan, or you can knit some blocks in stockinette or reverse stockinette, with or without garter stripes added, or you could knit different textures by different combinations of knit and purl stitches. There are a lot of classic stitch combinations. I'll just show you a few here besides the garter stitch. The first one is stockinette, or reverse stockinette, which I've already showed you a bit of. This is when you alternate knit and purl rows, and it's the smooth stitch pattern you see on the right side of a lot of sweaters. The stockinette stitch has knit rows on the right side of your work and purl on the wrong side. The reverse stockinette stitch has purl rows on the right side of your work and knit on the wrong side, or you can just flip over your stockinette block. Stockinette stitch has a tendency to curl towards the back side, and it's stretchy, so it's not necessarily the best choice for a side block on the Afghan. Another stitch pattern is broken garter stitch. For this pattern, you want to cast on a number of stitches that divides evenly by 3, so we'll cast on 21 for this block. You knit 3 stitches, purl 3 stitches, and repeat, knit 3, purl 3 to the end of the row. With 21 stitches, you end with a knit 3. And then you repeat this row until the block is big enough and cast off. What you end up with is a garter rib that shifts up or down a row every 3 stitches. It's an interesting effect, and this stitch lies pretty flat. Seed stitch is another stitch pattern that lies nice and flat. You can easily do it with any number of stitches, so let's stick with our 20. For right side rows, alternate knit 1, purl 1 all the way to the end, finishing with a purl. For your wrong side rows, alternate purl 1, knit 1 to the end, finishing with a knit. These 2 rows give you this nice nubby texture. If you have an odd number of stitches, you would knit 1, purl 1 each row, ending with a knit. Then there's rib stitch, which gets used a lot for cuffs on sleeves and the hems of sweaters. It pulls together a lot, so it's not necessarily the best choice for these blocks, but I'll show you anyway so you can see. Again, we've cast on 20 stitches, and this is a 1 by 1 rib. That means you knit 1, purl 1 to the end of the row, ending with a purl. Then repeat that row to the end of the block. That gives you this stacked column look that pulls together and stretches really nicely. You can also do a 2 by 2 or 3 by 3 rib by alternating knit 2, purl 2 or knit 3, purl 3. You just need to make sure that your stitch count is divided evenly by 4 for a 2 by 2 rib and by 6 for a 3 by 3 rib. One last pattern to show you. This is 4 by 4 checkerboard, and it's a little more complicated because there are 8 rows to the pattern. Start again with 20 stitches. First row, alternate knit 4, purl 4, ending on a knit. Row 2, purl 4, knit 4, ending on a purl. Repeat those 2 rows and you have your first line of checkerboard. Now, row 5 is like row 2, purl 4, knit 4, ending purl. Row 6 is the same as row 1. Knit 4, purl 4, ending with a knit. Repeat row 5 and 6, and your second line of checkerboard is done. Now, you repeat those 8 rows until your square is complete. You can stop a little early or a little late if having the pattern look nice is more important than getting the size perfect. As I said, I have a link in the description to these stitch patterns if you want to play around with them. That's all for this video. In the next one, we'll look at some common mistakes in knitting, how to spot them, and some basic fixes. Thanks for joining us for this Safe at Home Manitoba program. Stay safe inside your wall.